A bully slapped my 75-year-old mother to the floor. No one dared help. He laughed like he owned the town. He had no idea. I commanded Army Rangers. His smile disappeared seconds later. My mother ran the hardware store downtown for 31 years. She and my father opened it together back when the street still had 2 grocers and a movie theater. Most of that is gone now, but the store stayed because my mother refused every offer anyone ever made her to sell it. I used to ask her why, back when I was a teenager, embarrassed that my mom ran a place that smelled like sawdust instead of doing something that impressed my friend's parents. She always said the same thing. This is where your father and I built something. I'm not walking away from it because it's inconvenient. My father passed when I was 23, 3 years into my time in the Army. Heart attack behind the counter on an ordinary Tuesday. My mother found him. Everyone in town expected her to sell after that. She was 64, running a 2-person business alone, and she turned down every offer anyway. She hired a part-time clerk, a retired mechanic, and kept the doors open herself the rest of the week. I enlisted at 19, went through selection in my mid-20s, and by 34, I was commanding a company of Army Rangers, which is not a sentence that fits comfortably at Thanksgiving in a town where most people still think of me as the girl who used to stack paint cans for her dad. My mother has always been proud of me in the quiet way she's proud of everything. The deployment I'd just come off was 8 months, most of it overseas, most of it work I still can't describe in detail. By the time my leave came through, all I wanted out of 4 days home was quiet. Coffee at her table, maybe an afternoon behind the counter, restocking shelves like I did as a kid, pretending the last 15 years hadn't happened and I was still just her daughter. I flew in on a Thursday without telling her the exact day. I wanted to surprise her. I rented a car at the airport instead of calling her for a ride, part of the surprise. The drive takes just under 2 hours through farmland that hasn't changed as long as I've been alive. Same water tower, same church with the marquee that always has something slightly off about the spelling. I noticed changes on the way in before I noticed anything wrong. A new development going up on the east side, glossy signs advertising luxury townhomes starting in the low 400s, an absurd number for a town where most people I grew up with were still renting the same houses their parents rented. A new gas station chain putting the old one out of business. A strip mall where I remembered a soybean field. None of that struck me as strange. Towns change. I didn't think about it beyond a passing sense that the town looked a little more prosperous and a little less like itself. I pulled into the gravel lot behind the hardware store a little after noon. The building looks exactly the way it's looked my whole life. Brick facade, a hand-painted sign my father did himself, a wooden porch with 2 rocking chairs old men sit in on slow afternoons. The chairs were empty. That was the first thing that felt off, though I didn't register it as significant yet. Those chairs are almost never both empty during business hours unless the weather's bad, and the weather that day was fine. I got out planning to walk in quiet and surprise her from behind the counter, the way I used to as a teenager. I remember smiling to myself about it, thinking about her face when she turned around and saw me instead of wherever she assumed I still was. Then I got close enough to the door to hear that the radio wasn't on. My mother has kept a small radio behind the counter since before I was born, tuned low to the same country station, on every single time I have ever walked into that store. I have never once heard silence instead. I stood on the porch a second longer than I needed to. Through the front window, past the display of gardening tools my mother rotates every spring, I could see movement inside that didn't look like ordinary customers browsing for hinges or paint. I want to be honest that up until that moment, nothing about the trip had felt like anything other than an ordinary homecoming. I was a tired, happy woman on leave, walking toward a surprise reunion with her mom. The silence where the radio should have been was the first thread that made anything feel wrong. I moved closer to the window instead of the door, a habit I don't think I'll ever fully turn off. You don't walk blind into a room you can look into first. It's not paranoia, it's just how I'm built now, after enough deployments where the difference between looking first and walking in blind was the difference between someone going home and someone not. Through the glass, I saw 2 men near the register, facing away from me, arms crossed, watching something toward the back where the paint counter is. Neither was anyone I recognized, which in a town this size is itself worth noting. I know most of the regular faces who come through that store. These 2 weren't regulars. Dress shirts under jackets, the kind of clothes that don't belong around drywall dust. I moved along the porch toward the side window, the one that looks in past the seed display toward the paint counter where my mother mixes custom colors for people redoing their kitchens. That's when I saw her on the floor. She was behind the counter, one hand braced against the counter's edge like she was trying to get up, the other pressed to the side of her face. Standing over her, close enough there was no reading it any other way, was a man in a leather jacket, mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, talking down at her loud enough I could hear the tone through the glass, even without making out every word. For about 2 full seconds, I was not a lieutenant colonel at all. I was just a woman looking through a window at her 75-year-old mother on the floor of the store she built with her dead husband, with a stranger standing over her. Then the training took over, the way it's designed to. My body was already moving toward the door before my mind finished processing what my eyes had shown it. I remember thinking, with a cold clarity I felt before in situations that mattered, that whatever was happening in that store was about to be over very quickly, one way or another. The bell above the door rang when I pushed it open, and for half a second nobody inside reacted to it at all. The inside of the store looked wrong beyond just my mother on the floor. 3 other customers stood frozen near the aisles, none moving toward the front. An older man I recognized as a regular, a woman with a toddler on her hip who looked like she was deciding whether to bolt for the door, and my mother's part-time clerk, hands half raised like he'd been trying to calm things down and had been overruled. Nobody had called called the police yet. The man in the leather jacket had walked in with the two men from the front window, and something about the three of them together had made the room go still in the way people go still when stepping in might make things worse. Small towns aren't naive. People in that room had clocked the two men as muscle before they clocked anything else. And I have told you more than once that this doesn't need to happen this way, the man was saying as I came through the door, in the flat, irritated tone of someone who considers himself extremely reasonable and is furious the world keeps forcing him to prove it. You're making this difficult for no reason. My mother, still on the floor, said something back I didn't catch clearly, but I caught the shape of it. Refusal. He crouched slightly like he was going to say something directly to her face, and that's when I spoke. Step away from her. My voice came out flatter and quieter than I expected, and it cut through the room. Every head turned. The clerk's hands dropped. The woman with the toddler took a half step toward the door. The man straightened up slowly and turned, and I got my first clear look at his face. He looked like money. Not flashy, but the understated, tailored kind that doesn't need to announce itself, that assumes it will be recognized and deferred to on sight. He looked at me the way you'd look at an interruption rather than a threat. Up and down, quick and dismissive, and I watched him decide in real time that I wasn't worth taking seriously. And who are you supposed to be? He said. It wasn't really a question. Her daughter, I said. You're going to step away from her right now. He laughed, a short exhale through his nose, like I'd said something mildly amusing at a dinner party. Her daughter, he repeated, trying the words out. They clearly meant nothing to him. Okay, this doesn't concern you, sweetheart. This is between me and your mother, and it'd go a lot smoother for everyone if you waited outside. It concerns me the second you put your hands on her, I said. Something flickered across his face, the first crack in his composure, though it wasn't fear. It was the irritation of a man used to controlling every room he walks into. Nobody put their hands on anybody, he said. So blatantly a lie, I almost respected the smoothness of it. Your mother got upset and lost her footing. These things happen when people get emotional about business decisions. Behind him, still on the floor, my mother made a small sound that wasn't agreement. He hit me, she said, her voice thinner than I wanted, but clear. His jaw tightened at being contradicted in front of an audience. He glanced at her, at the two men who'd come with him, then back at me, calculating. Look, he said, shifting into something more conciliatory, the voice of a man trying to sound like the only adult in the room. I understand this looks bad, but your mother has been sitting on a piece of property holding up a development worth a great deal of money to a great many people in this town, and she's been unreasonable about it for months. Things got heated. I'm not proud of that, but nobody needs to make this into more than it is. You hit a 75-year-old woman, I said. She's exaggerating, he said, the reasonable voice curdling at the edges. And with respect, I don't know you, and I don't know what you think you'll accomplish giving me a hard time. I run half the business in this county. I have relationships with people who matter here. Whatever you think you're protecting your mother from, I'd think twice before making an enemy of me over a real estate disagreement. It landed on me the way threats from men like that always land on people who've spent real time around actual danger, as noise. A man performing power instead of a man who understood what power actually cost. I don't think you understand who you're talking to, I said. He smiled, patient, the smile you give someone you've already decided isn't worth taking seriously. Enlighten me then. I command a company of Army Rangers, I said. I have spent the last 8 months overseas doing work I'm not going to describe to you in your mother's hardware store. Every man who has served under me would drop what they're doing tonight if I called and told them what you just did to my mother. That is who you're talking to. For a moment, nobody made a sound. Even the two men by the register had gone still in a different way, a way that suggested they'd understood something the man in the leather jacket hadn't caught up to yet. He didn't believe me right away. I could see it. The quick scan of me, jeans, a plain jacket, nothing matching whatever picture he had of a military officer. He was looking for a uniform, for insignia, and finding none made the mistake men like him make constantly, assuming power always announces itself the way he's used to announcing his. Sure you do, he said, but there was the smallest hesitation first, half a second where I watched him consider it and then talk himself out of it because it was inconvenient to believe. I didn't argue. Arguing with a man who's already decided not to believe you rarely accomplishes anything except wasting time you don't have. Instead, I walked past him, not shoving him aside, just moving at a normal pace directly through the space where he stood, angling around him without acknowledging him as an obstacle at all, the way you'd walk past furniture in an inconvenient spot. It unsettled him more than a shove would have. I watched the confusion land on his face, the confusion of being treated as irrelevant by someone you've just tried to intimidate. He said something behind me, some half-formed protest, but I was already past him and kneeling beside my mother. Her cheek was red and swelling along the bone under her eye, a thin line of blood at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes, when they found mine, were clear and sharp and furious in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She gripped my forearm before I could say anything. Hard enough I felt it through my sleeve. You're supposed to be overseas, she said, which was absurd enough in that moment that it almost made me laugh despite everything. Surprise, I said quietly, and got my arm under her shoulders to help her sit up against the base of the counter. Behind me, the man's voice picked back up, louder now, aimed at the room. This is exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction that makes simple business disputes into something they don't need to be. Nobody assaulted anybody. An elderly woman had an accident during a heated conversation. I'd strongly advise everyone in this room to remember that clearly if anyone asks. A threat dressed up as advice, aimed at the clerk and the two witnesses. I got my mother settled against the counter and looked past her at him. Call the sheriff, I said. Now. He was already moving, phone in hand, dialing before I finished the sentence. The man in the leather jacket turned toward the sound, and for the first time I saw something in his face that wasn't composed irritation, calculation. A man rapidly reassessing how badly this had gotten away from him. "There's no need for that," he said. "Faster now, clip. This has already been blown out of proportion. I'm happy to sit down with your mother once tempers have cooled." "You're not going anywhere," I said, standing to face him fully. "And you're not going to keep talking like you're the only person here whose version matters." He glanced at the two men who'd come with him, some silent question passing between them. One of them, the taller, took half a step toward the door, already deciding this wasn't his problem. "You're making a mistake," the man in the leather jacket said, voice dropping lower, aimed only at me. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I have relationships in this town that go a lot deeper than you think. Judges, officials, people who owe me favors I could call in without blinking. Whatever you think is about to happen here, it isn't going to go the way you expect." I looked at him for a long moment, long enough to watch a flicker of genuine uncertainty cross his face for the first time. "I've spent my career dealing with people a great deal more dangerous than you," I said. "You hit an old woman in her own store because she wouldn't sign something. Whatever favors you think you're owed in this town, none of them are going to matter in about 10 minutes. Somewhere in the distance, faint at first and then unmistakable, I heard the sound of a siren. The cruiser pulled in fast enough I heard the tires before I saw the lights, and less than a minute later, my cousin walked in wearing a sheriff's uniform, one hand near his belt out of habit. He's been sheriff for 6 years, the kind of cousin you don't see often enough, but who you'd trust with anything the moment you did. He took one look at the room, one look at my mother against the counter with her cheek swelling, and his expression changed, the specific stillness of someone suppressing a much larger reaction because the job in front of him required something calmer. "Somebody want to explain what happened here," he said, even though there was an edge underneath it that made the two men who'd come with the leather jacket man take an involuntary half step back. The man started talking immediately, fast, smooth, already reframing the afternoon. "Sheriff, I'm glad you're here, because this has gotten completely out of hand over what was a simple misunderstanding. I didn't ask you," my cousin said, not even looking at him, eyes still on my mother. "Evelyn, are you hurt?" My mother gave him the short version. He listened without interrupting, jaw tightening with every detail, and when she finished, he turned to the man with an expression gone entirely cold. "You struck a 75-year-old woman in her own place of business, in front of witnesses. Is there any part of that you're going to dispute to my face?" "She fell," the man said. "I never touched her." The clerk spoke up, voice shaking with the anger of someone forced to watch without stopping it. "I saw him hit her. I'll say that in front of anybody who asks." The woman with the toddler nodded, which was confirmation enough. My cousin looked at the man for a long moment, then reached for the cuffs on his belt. He didn't fight it, surprising given how much noise he'd made minutes before, but men who rely on intimidation instead of actual physical confidence tend to go quiet fast once handcuffs are involved. He kept talking, though the tone shifted from threatening to pleading. "This is going to look very bad for a lot of people," he said, to nobody in particular. "I want it on record I'm fully prepared to make this right. Whatever needs to happen with the property, whatever this woman wants, I am prepared to be reasonable." My cousin ignored him and walked him toward the door, where one of the two men who'd come with him was already standing near the exit, deciding whether staying or leaving looked worse. My cousin told him flatly to stay put, that he'd have questions for both of them, and the man complied without argument, which told me everything about how much loyalty existed in that arrangement. Once the man in the leather jacket was in the back of the cruiser, my cousin came back inside and crouched in front of my mother. "Tell me his name," he said. My mother told him. What mattered in that moment was that my cousin's face changed slightly hearing it, a small flicker of recognition. "He's been trying to buy up half the block for the past year," my cousin said. "There's a development going up on the east side. I didn't realize he'd started coming after individual holdouts directly." That explanation settled something in the room. A wealthy developer, frustrated by a stubborn holdout, had lost his temper and crossed a line he assumed his money would protect him from crossing. Ugly, but familiar ugly, the kind you hear about in small towns getting swallowed by development money. It felt in that moment like the whole thing had reached its natural conclusion. I remember thinking, watching my cousin help my mother to her feet, that the worst of it was over. I was wrong about that, though it would take another 2 days for me to understand exactly how wrong. We closed the store early. The clerk offered to handle the last hour himself, but my mother, despite everything, insisted on locking up properly herself, checking the register, turning off the lights in the order she always turns them off in, a ritual that steadied her more than sitting down would have. I drove her to the urgent care clinic on the edge of town, and a doctor who used to coach youth soccer with my father confirmed no fracture, just deep bruising that would fade in a week or two, and a small cut inside her lip that didn't need stitches. She was quiet in the waiting room in a way that worried me more than if she'd been upset. My mother has never been a quiet woman. That night, back at her kitchen table, she finally started talking. "He's been coming around for months," she said, turning a mug of tea in slow circles without drinking. "Started polite, made an offer for the store in spring, said I should think about retirement instead of running myself into the ground. I told him no. He came back with a bigger number. I told him no again. Why didn't you tell me any of this?" I asked. "Because there was nothing to tell. A man wanted to buy my store, and I said no." It wasn't until the last month that it started feeling different. He stopped being polite, started implying things about permits, about zoning, about how difficult things could get for a small business owner who made powerful people unhappy. "That's not a business negotiation," I said. "That's intimidation." "I know that now," she said, tired in a way her injuries alone didn't explain. "I suppose I thought I could handle it the way I handled everything else. I didn't think it would turn into what happened today." We sat with that a while. I remember watching her hands, hands, still slightly unsteady around the mug, and thinking about how many years she'd spent absorbing pressure quietly rather than asking for help, a habit I recognized because I'd inherited a version of it myself. Nearly 11 that night, my phone rang. An unfamiliar local number. A reporter from the county paper heard about the incident from a police scanner, wanted a comment. I told him no comment and hung up, thinking it was a minor annoyance. I should have thought harder about it. The reporter called again the next morning while I was still making coffee. His tone was different, less like someone chasing a quick local crime blurb, and more like someone who pulled a thread and found it didn't stop where he expected. "I did some digging into the name your cousin gave out yesterday," he said, "and I wanted to ask you something because it isn't sitting right with me." "Go ahead," I said. "The name matches a business filing for a development company in this county. But when I tried to run down more on him, prior business history, anything explaining the leverage your cousin described, I'm coming up almost empty. He surfaces on filings starting about 14 months ago. Before that, nothing. No prior businesses under that name in this state, no public record of him existing at all. People relocate," I said. "People start companies in new states without much of a paper trail." "Sure, but I've covered enough of these development stories to know what an established developer's footprint looks like moving into a new area. Financing history, prior projects somewhere else, investors with names attached. This guy has none of it. It's like he appeared here fully formed with money nobody can trace and immediately started buying up property from people who couldn't afford lawyers to push back." I felt something shift, the sensation of a piece of information landing where it doesn't fit cleanly with everything around it. I felt that before, in briefings, and learned to take it seriously rather than dismiss it as overthinking. "What are you saying exactly?" I asked. "I'm saying I don't think this is just a rich developer who lost his temper with a stubborn holdout. I think there's something underneath this none of us are seeing yet. The story your cousin told yesterday, angry developer snaps and hits an old woman, is too clean for how murky everything underneath it actually is." After I hung up, I sat at my mother's kitchen table a long time, running back through everything that had happened, looking for the detail I'd missed. I called my cousin that afternoon, and I could hear he'd been having a version of the same conversation with himself. "He made bail this morning," he said, before I asked. "Cash, paid in full, arranged before sunup. That takes either serious personal liquidity or somebody making calls very quickly to people who don't ask questions about where the money's coming from. Which do you think it was? Don't know yet, but here's what's bothering me more. When we processed him, there was a flag from the state system, not a criminal record, an administrative hold, the kind you see when a name's connected to an active investigation elsewhere, and local agencies get told not to release details without checking in first. An investigation into what? That's exactly what I don't know. I made the call I'm supposed to make, and the person on the other end told me politely that details were need to know and mine hadn't been established. Not something that happens over a small-town assault charge. I sat with that. In my line of work, phrases like need to know and administrative hold carry a specific weight, a vocabulary I recognize because I've used it myself. "Say that again," I said, slowly. "There's a hold on information related to him. Somebody above the level of a county sheriff wanted to know the moment his name hit a system and wanted enough control over what got shared that they told me directly not to push. That's not a real estate dispute," I said quietly. "No, but until somebody above my pay grade tells me, I'm just a county sheriff sitting on a man out on bail who's connected to something a great deal bigger than a hardware store." I looked out my mother's kitchen window at the street I'd grown up on, and for the first time since walking into that store, I felt something that wasn't anger. The specific alertness of realizing a situation isn't what it first appeared to be. I made a call that evening to a former colleague who'd moved into a role adjacent to financial intelligence work, tracing money and shell structures for reasons above my clearance to fully understand even when we'd served together. I gave her the bare outline. A man showing up in a small town 14 months ago with significant capital and no traceable history, buying property aggressively, resorting to intimidation and now violence, and a name flag serious enough a county sheriff had been told not to share details. There was a long pause before she answered. "I can't tell you what I don't know, but the pattern isn't unfamiliar. Capital appearing suddenly in overlooked places, buying up land fast, using pressure instead of patience, building leverage where nobody in Washington is watching. That pattern has a name in the world I work in now, and it isn't real estate development. Sometimes it's laundering, sometimes it's positioning, buying near infrastructure years before anyone announces plans, so the buyer's already sitting on the property when value spikes. And sometimes, less often, it's a front for something uglier that needs a legitimate-looking business to justify money nobody wants traced. Which of those do you think this is? I have no idea, but I wouldn't assume this ends with a county assault charge. Whatever this man is, the version that hit your mother is probably the smallest, most exposed piece of it. Men like that don't get administrative holds by accident. Something bigger is already watching him. You just happened to walk into the one moment his temper made him visible to people who weren't already watching." After I hung up, I sat with that a long time. I thought about the two men who'd come with him, dressed too well for a hardware store. The stillness of men used to being present without participating directly. I thought about the townhome development on the edge of town, prices too high for anyone who actually lived there. In 14 months, this man had gone from nothing to buying a meaningful percentage of the town's most valuable real estate, and nobody local had slowed him down until my mother refused to sell and he lost his temper in front of witnesses. It didn't feel like a story about a bully and a business dispute anymore. It felt like I'd walked into the one loose thread of something much larger, operating quietly under the surface of my hometown for over a year without anyone noticing what it actually was. I drove to the sheriff's office the next morning instead of calling. My cousin looked like a man who hadn't slept much either. I made some calls, I told him, sitting across from him without waiting to be invited. Somebody I trust in financial tracking thinks this looks less like real estate and more like something using real estate as cover. He rubbed his face with both hands. I've been thinking the same since yesterday. I pulled every county filing tied to his name I could access. Every purchase, every zoning request, every permit going back to when he first showed up. He spread printed pages across the desk. The first a simple map with several parcels highlighted, clustered in two distinct areas, rather than spread evenly across whatever was cheapest. Every property he's bought or tried to buy sits along one of two lines, my cousin said, tracing them. This corridor, running toward the interstate junction, and this one, along the old rail spur that hasn't been active in almost 20 years. Nothing downtown that would make sense for a simple retail development. Not the cheaper, empty land on the north side, just these two very specific lines. What's out at the interstate junction? I asked. Nothing yet, but there's been talk for years, mostly rumor, about a federal logistics or distribution project eventually locating somewhere along that corridor if the right incentives lined up. Nothing official, nothing confirmed. And the rail spur? Same story. An old proposal, decades old, about reactivating it if a large enough distribution operation justified the cost. Dead for years. Which is exactly why it would be valuable to buy up cheap now, if somebody knew it was about to become relevant again before the rest of the town did. I sat back, feeling pieces slide into a shape I recognized from an entirely different part of my life. This wasn't a man who wanted a hardware store because it was in his way. This was a man positioning along corridors that only made sense to buy up in advance if he already knew or strongly suspected something significant was coming that the town itself didn't know about yet. Who would know that ahead of time? I asked quietly. Before it's public. My cousin looked at me a long moment before answering. Somebody with access to planning at a level neither of us has. That's not a real estate instinct. That's somebody working from information they shouldn't have. I didn't sleep well that night, turning over who would have access to that kind of information ahead of time. Almost 1 in the morning, a name surfaced I hadn't let myself think about directly until then, because it felt too close. There's a man in this county, an old family friend of sorts my father knew from his years on the planning commission, who spent the last several years in a regional economic development office. Exactly the kind of office that would hear early whispers about federal logistics interest long before anything became public. I called the reporter first thing the next morning, instead of confronting the possibility alone. I think I might know how he got ahead of this, I said, and laid out the thought. The reporter was quiet a moment. That's a serious thing to float about a man with that access, but it's not the first time that name has come up in something I've been looking at. At least 2 other property acquisitions in the county over the past 2 years in different towns followed a similar pattern. Quiet buyer, no track record, buying ahead of infrastructure announcements that came out publicly 6 to 18 months later. I hadn't connected them, different counties, different buyers on paper, but if there's a common source feeding multiple buyers, or the same buyer under different fronts, that explains a lot. How do we find out for certain? Carefully. If there's a real leak of protected planning information out of a regional development office, that's not just an ugly local story anymore. That's federal. Wire fraud, potentially, or worse, depending how the money moved. And it means the administrative hold your cousin ran into wasn't about the man who hit your mother specifically. It was about protecting an investigation into whatever's happening underneath him. I sat with that a long moment, the shape of the last 2 days shifting again around a new center of gravity. So this was never really about my mother's store, I said slowly. I don't think it ever was. Your mother's store was just the one piece of land where the buyer ran into somebody who wouldn't fold. Everywhere else, people took the money and moved on quietly, and nobody noticed the pattern. Your mother said no and kept saying no, long enough that he lost his temper in front of witnesses, which means, without meaning to, she's the reason any of this is surfacing at all. I brought all of it to my cousin that afternoon, laying out the pattern across 3 counties, the quiet buyer with no visible history, timing lined up too neatly with unannounced infrastructure decisions, and the possibility of a single source feeding that information from inside a regional office supposed to keep it protected. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet a long moment. If you're right, the administrative hold makes complete sense. It was never about protecting a small-town assault suspect. It was about protecting an active investigation reaching well past this county, and my flag just happened to be the first place it surfaced publicly because he got arrested somewhere visible. Which means somebody's already watching him, I said. Which means we need to be very careful how we move next. If there's a federal thread already unspooling underneath this, the last thing either of us wants is to trip over it clumsily and tip him off, or step on evidence somebody spent months building. I need to make a call I should have made the moment that hold came through. He picked up his phone and made a call I wasn't part of. Careful, measured language, confirming details, cross-referencing names, the rhythm of 2 professionals feeling out how much they're each allowed to share. When he hung up, his expression had gone more serious than anything I'd seen from him since he first walked into that store. There's an active federal investigation, he said. Has been for almost a year, tracking exactly the pattern we've been describing across multiple counties. They've been building it slowly, trying to trace the money to its actual source before making arrests, because arresting one front man too early risks the whole structure scattering before they can follow it all the way up. And my mother's case just forced their hand, I said. Your mother's case put his name in a public arrest record with witnesses, which meant they had to move faster than they wanted, or risk him disappearing the moment he realized how exposed he'd become. They're grateful in a strange way, even though nobody's going to say that out loud to your mother directly. What happened to her accidentally cracked open something they'd been trying to to get a handle on for months. I sat with that a while, feeling something settle into place heavier and stranger than the clean anger I'd walked into that store with 2 days earlier. This had never been a story about one bad man losing his temper over property he wanted. It was a story about a much larger structure, quietly extracting value out of small, overlooked places, and my mother, refusing to move, had become the single loose thread that made the whole thing visible. 2 federal agents arrived 3 days later, driving an unmarked sedan that nonetheless somehow looked exactly like what it was the moment it pulled into the gravel lot. They met with my cousin first, then asked to speak with my mother and me together, sitting at her kitchen table with the same careful, measured language I'd heard my cousin use on the phone days earlier. What they told us filled in the shape of something I'd only been able to sketch in outline. The man who'd hit my mother wasn't the architect of anything. He was, in the agent's words, a facilitator, a face put in front of local deals to keep the actual source of the money and the advance information several layers removed from anything traceable. Recruited roughly 14 months earlier specifically because he had no prior public profile, nothing that would draw scrutiny before he'd already closed several deals. The advance information about infrastructure corridors and rail spurs, the thing that let him buy ahead of value spikes across multiple counties, was indeed coming from inside the Regional Economic Development Office, exactly as the reporter and I had begun to suspect. But it wasn't coming from the family friend I'd worried about in the middle of the night. It was coming from someone several levels above him, someone with access not just to regional planning, but to preliminary federal siting discussions, someone who had been quietly monetizing that access for the better part of 2 years, feeding it selectively to a small handful of buyers operating under different names in different counties, all of it eventually tracing back to the same small group of people at the very top who never appeared publicly in any of it at all. We've been building this case slowly because the money moves through enough layers that rushing it would have let the people at the top simply cut ties and disappear before we could prove anything against them, one of the agents said. Your mother's case forced an arrest that put one piece of the structure in a public record with witnesses. That accelerated our timeline. We'd rather have had a few more months, but what we have now is considerably stronger than it was a week ago. My mother sat through most of this in silence, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, and when the agents finished, she asked the question I think both of us had been circling without saying out loud. Was I ever actually in danger? She asked. Or was I just in the way of something bigger than I understood? The agent who'd done most of the talking considered it carefully. Both, I think. You were in the way of something much larger than a hardware store, and he lost his temper because you were the first person in this pattern who never folded, but you were also genuinely in danger, in the sense that men under that kind of pressure don't always stop at raising their voice. You were fortunate your daughter walked in when she did. Not everyone in this pattern who said no had a ranger commander walk through their door. And after the agents left, my mother and I sat at that kitchen table a long time without saying much. The tea in her mug had gone cold. Outside, the light was shifting into early evening, the particular gold it turns in that kitchen in late summer, the same light from 100 ordinary dinners as a kid. 14 months, my mother said eventually, more to herself than to me. He's been in this town 14 months, and I don't think I ever once heard him say a true thing to my face. You held your ground longer than anyone else in this pattern, I said. That's not nothing. I didn't do it because I was brave, she said. I did it because your father and I built that store with our own hands, and I wasn't going to let some man in an expensive jacket talk me out of it because he offered a bigger number than last time. I didn't know I was standing in the middle of something this size. I just knew I wasn't selling. I understood sitting there that this was the part of her that had always been there underneath the version most people in town saw. The woman who smiled at every customer and mixed custom paint colors and never seemed like someone capable of standing her ground against real pressure. She'd been doing exactly that for months, alone, because to her it had never felt like something worth making into a bigger story than it needed to be. I should have told you sooner, she said. I'm glad I was here, I said, but you don't owe me an apology for trying to protect me from worrying about you from another continent. She reached across the table and took my hand, the same hand she'd gripped that first afternoon on the floor of the store, and held it a long moment without saying anything else. I flew back to base 4 days later, same as planned. The leave I'd imagined as quiet coffee and restocked shelves instead spent watching my hometown come apart at a seam none of us had known was there. Before I left, my mother walked me out to the gravel lot, the same lot where I'd parked that first afternoon without any idea what I was about to walk into. You didn't come home to deal with any of this, she said. You came home for 4 days off. I came home to see you, I said. The rest just happened to be there when I arrived. She looked back at the store, the hand-painted sign my father made, the porch with its 2 rocking chairs, both occupied that morning by regulars who'd come back once word got around the doors were open again. She didn't say anything for a moment, just took it in the way you take in something you almost lost without fully understanding how close you'd come. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't decided to surprise me that day, she said. If you'd called ahead like a normal person and told me what flight to pick you up from. Don't, I said, quieter than I meant to. I have to, she said, because I think about it anyway, whether I want to or not. I didn't have an answer that would have made it smaller, so I didn't try to give her one. I just put my arms around her, careful of the spot on her cheek still faintly discolored under her makeup, and held on longer than either of us probably needed in the gravel lot behind a store that had almost cost her everything, and had instead cracked open something none of us had known was hiding under the surface of the only home either of us had ever really had. When I finally let go, she wiped her eyes once, quickly, and told me to get on the road before I missed my flight. I got in the car. I looked back once in the mirror at her her standing in that gravel lot in front of the store she'd refused to give up, getting smaller behind me the way everything from home always does the moment you start driving away from it. And then I kept going, carrying all of it with me, whether I was ready to or not.